Aloha and welcome to our Huliau Climate Literacy Project workshop. My name is Lily Solano. I'm the program director with Maui Huliau Foundation. I'm really excited to share with you today these resources and how we may be able to help you implement them in your classroom. Before we go over those resources and activities, I briefly want to just share a little bit about who we are. So Maui Huliau Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to promoting environmental literacy and leadership among Maui youth. We were founded 12 years ago by our executive director, Malia Cahill. We offer a variety of programs from our filmmaking club to where students make really short films about different environmental topics to our leadership council for high school students interested in environmental leadership. You may be most familiar with our Huliau Green events and might have seen some of our waste stations at community events. This program helps divert waste from landfills through education and waste reduction, like recycling and composting. We are currently accepting applications for our environmental filmmaking club and leadership council. So if, as you're welcoming your students back this semester, please share with them these really great opportunities for the fall. And the leadership council is a year-long program. In addition to that, we're really excited to announce our first professional development course, Kukulu Pilina, open to Maui DOE secondary teachers. This course will highlight curriculum from our second Google Classroom, our Maui Aloha Aina classroom. For more information, you can check out or visit our website. So a little bit more about our climate literacy project that started in 2017. It's now served over about 1,300 students from 5 Maui schools. The mission of the project is to work with mainly science teachers in grades 8 through 12 to integrate hands-on climate literacy activities into their curriculum. The curriculum is in alignment with the next generation science standards. And since the project started, we've had teachers provide us input and continue to build and improve this project. A really good example of that is this past year, we launched our virtual classroom through Google Classroom to share these resources. So we modified a lot of our in-class activities into virtual activities, which I'll share some examples of those activities today. We've also designed a field trip component to this project, which I'll touch on at the end. And lastly, we've been a lot more involved in assisting teachers carry out student projects. I'll share some examples of those projects later in this presentation. So we utilize Google Classroom to organize all of our resources. These are both virtual and in-class activities. In addition to just organizing the resources, as a lot of you may be familiar with Google Classroom, it allows us to share any updates and receive or share feedback that other teachers have provided. So it's really just a perfect platform because we just finished a year of virtual school, a lot of teachers are familiar with how to navigate Google Classroom. So our classroom is split up into 3 main units. We have Unit 1, which covers the causes of climate change. Unit 2 are the impacts. And Unit 3, we go into solutions. Each unit is composed of different parts. Activities are either developed by us or we've modified existing activities from different sources, as well as NOAA data. Each activity will have those sources listed. So it's also a really good opportunity for teachers to be exposed to other resources that they may be able to use in their classroom. Each unit includes a teacher guide. This teacher guide, in addition to that, includes the answer keys to all of the activities, and it walks you through all of the activities and provides you detailed instructions. You'll find sources for each activity here, and for those activities that have an in-class option, it's included in the teacher guide. Now, zooming in a little bit further, each part within a unit includes a list of those activities. Pre-recorded Prezi video. So the Prezi is the program that I am using here today. So we actually record all of the introductions to these different parts or units, and we share that with teachers. So you have the option of sharing that with your students directly, or we also provide you with a link to the template, and you can modify it to make it your own or record your own presentation. As another option to Prezi, we also have Google Slides. So we do provide the Google Slide decks for teachers in addition with teacher notes so that they have access to modifying that. So now I'm going to briefly go over each unit and kind of go over some of the activities. that are found within the unit. So just again, a quick recap. Each unit, you'll find a teacher guide, the answer keys. You have either the Prezi templates or the Google slide decks, instructions and activities that are listed for this particular part, as well as the additional resources. So Unit 1 really focuses on the carbon cycle and how humans have changed that cycle, CO2 in the atmosphere, and a really important component, weather versus climate. So in the first part, we're really focusing on that carbon cycle. The main kind of activity or the highlighted activity here is going to be the carbon cycle game. This was originally used as an in-class activity, but during our pivot, we created a virtual version of this. So in this activity, students are essentially visiting different environments as a carbon molecule. They are rolling a dice, and that's how they're moving from one environment to the other. They play 2 rounds. Round 1 before human influence and round 2 after human influence, and they compare their journeys from round 1 and 2. This can be an in-class activity where you will set up these different stations or environments, and the students visit these different environments by rolling a dice. For the online activities, students will move from each station, but they do so using a virtual dice roller and a Google form to guide them. We also had success leading this activity via Zoom, or optionally, if you have enough computers in your classroom, each student can use a virtual dice roller and participate in the activity. So again, this is just a really good example of how our curriculum has expanded, now incorporating both in-class and virtual activities. Part 2, we're talking about CO2 in the atmosphere. The activity 2 and 3 listed here are short videos and questions in a Google form, and they learn about the seasonal CO2 patterns. But the main activity is graphing CO2 in the atmosphere. And so for this one, you assign each student data collected from Mauna Loa of the CO2 levels from a 3-year period, and they graph this data. If it's done in person, you can actually connect these graphs because each student will have different 3-year periods, and they can see that trend of CO2 increasing. So you can talk about the Keeling curve, the overall trend of CO2, as well as the seasonal trends that you see. The same activity can be done online. You can assign each student data, and they graph it using an online chart maker. So we have the PDFs of the data and found a really great free online chart maker. The videos can be used to supplement the discussion from the main activity when talking about why CO2 levels change seasonally and how levels are overall increasing. So moving on into part 3. Part 3 focuses on weather versus climate. As we know, an important topic of understanding climate change is being able to distinguish weather and climate. The first activity, Anila Kilo, students practice the skill of kilo, or to observe, and document their observations. This can be an activity assigned as homework and discussed in class about what the students observed. The discussion would serve to help them understand the difference between weather and climate by discussing what the weather is like normally in their area and whether this was represented in their daily observations. Another activity, weather versus climate, students use a deck of cards that we created with different descriptions, and they have to identify if it's an example of weather or climate. As a virtual activity, we use the online flashcard program Quizlet. In both the in-person and virtual, you can make it more engaging by creating a game or competition. Quizlets can be done as a full class activity if you have access to a projector. The presentation for this section really goes into the different factors that influence Earth's climate. So depending on how much experience your students have with these topics, this is a section that can be modified or shortened. This is a really good example of how we can assist you with modifying the program and what activities to include or activities that you can skip. So moving on into Unit 2, we're focusing on the different impacts of climate change. We touch on both global and local impacts in this unit. Looking at part 1 is melting ice and sea level rise. The first activity, the global warming and melting ice. We have students analyze a number of graphs and data in a Google form to understand what is happening with the decline of ice. The in-class version of this activity includes setting up a sea and land ice demo in the classroom. and you use these labels and ask these questions to students as they observe what happens to the melted ice in the container. In addition, the glaciers then and now cards allow students to see how glaciers have changed. So we converted these glacier images into a virtual activity in the Google form. Part 2 is ocean impacts, which is a little bit of a lengthier part, and we split it up into two subsections: coral bleaching and ocean acidification. Coral reefs are such an important ecosystem here in Hawaii, and we generally see a lot of interest from students when learning about ocean habitats that we really focus on sharing these impacts. So part 2A for coral bleaching features introduction activities to what corals are, the ideal environment that they grow in, and they analyze past data from coral bleaching events. The monitoring coral reefs in the field is an interactive activity where students analyze these large printed transects from NOAA, and they calculate how much coral is bleached. We have part 2, which is ocean acidification, and we have this in-class lab using straws and an indicator solution where students see how CO2 from their breath can change the indicator solution. This is a really good segue to really understanding how too much CO2 in the atmosphere can make the ocean acidic. The virtual activity, students watch short videos and they look at how shells are deteriorating as oceans are becoming more acidic. Both of these two activities that I talked about do require some supply kits, and I will touch on that at the end. Part 3 takes a closer look at extreme weather events. The virtual activity has students research different weather events and use this online site, which is really neat. It's called EarthNoll to visually track the storm. So it's almost essentially like storm chasing. So this site allows students to look at the wind pattern, the wind speed, precipitation. So they're actually tracking and seeing how these storms are forming. The in-class activity looks at NOAA data of tides during these storm events, and it looks at how sea level rise, moon phases, and storm surge all contribute to the perfect storm. So they also look at photos and videos of the devastation from some of these events. So for example, this is Hurricane Maria. So looking at part 4, this is actually a recent addition to the project where we look closer at climate change impacts in Hawaii. The one activity that, two of the activities that I'll highlight here is VI in the era of climate change. And students will analyze drought maps and learn how sea level rise can impact freshwater sources. Students also look at data of wildfires in Hawaii to see if there's been an increase in wildfires as we're recording hotter and drier summers. The Prezi for this part covers a lot of really great aspects in terms of the different impacts in Hawaii, including ocean impacts. Now, moving on into Unit 3, so solutions. So after wrapping up Unit 2, it is a lot of information. It can be a little bit difficult or disheartening to learn about all of the impacts. So Unit 3 is really meant to kind of empower students to now start thinking about solutions. Looking at part 1, a global problem, students look at their individual ecological footprint. You might be familiar with an online calculator that is available where students can actually calculate how many Earths they would need if everyone on Earth would live like they do. And they also get to compare how other countries live. And then we have in the global goals activity, students look at the UN Sustainable Goals, which are 17 interlinked global goals designed to achieve a better, more sustainable future for all. A lot of these have connections to climate solutions, which we incorporate into part 3 in Unit 3. So I'll cover that briefly in part 3. In part 2, we have students learn about how scientists study climate and why it's still a controversial topic. So the climate myths activity is an in-class activity, but we do have an online version now. And it looks at different climate myths, and students have to match the correct scientific response. One of the newer activities that we developed is guiding students on how to talk about climate change. We utilize videos from the Alliance of Climate Education, which was a really great resource to guide them on trying to have this conversation with a friend or family member. We also explore environmental justice and social conflicts around environmental issues. One thing to note that some of these activities in this particular unit are not really heavy on the science side. What we've seen in the past with some schools is that science teachers will collaborate with other teachers teaching other subjects. And if this isn't an option, it can really be a short introduction to either the Sustainable Development Goals or even this one where we talk about how to talk about climate change or the environmental justice side. Looking at finding solutions, so part 3, um, this is really where we really start focusing on solutions and empowering students to start thinking about climate change solutions. In the mitigation versus adaptation activity, we introduce these two strategies and have students identify what each climate change solution is. Is an example of mitigation or adaptation, or in some cases, it's an overlap and it's both. This is a good example of an activity that we don't have an in-class version yet, but we are working on it and we'll update it in the classroom. But something like creating flashcards where students have to explore different solutions and identify if they're adaptation or mitigation. The sea level rise in Hawaii, we use the Pacios Islands observing system, which is a sea level rise viewer that shows the impacts under different scenarios. This can be done virtually using the Google form that we've created, or if you have access to a projector or enough computers for each student, this is another one that can be done as a group in the classroom. In part 4, taking action, we are really honing in on these different climate change solutions. The main activity is around Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown is a framework of 80 different solutions that a group of scientists have compiled and ranked on how effective they are. These solutions mitigate greenhouse gases by either avoiding emissions and or sequestering carbon dioxide. There are different sectors, and students research a solution that interests them. So, for example, there's things like health and education. So, the benefit of educating women and girls. We have things like plant rich diet, reducing the amount of meat that we consume. And another good example is composting, or reducing the amount of food that goes into the landfill where it produces methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So, from there, they create a concept map from one of those project drawdown solutions that they selected. They basically have in the center here they have their solution that they've researched, and then they talk about the benefits, what it is, and then if there are any disadvantages, they list that. And then they actually will tie back that solution to 3 sustainable development goals. So we do have a worksheet that guides students through this activity. And again, this is another one that we've had success doing as a um, distance learning activity and in person as well. And what's really important is that these discussions and exploring solutions, oftentimes students then start to develop projects that they can carry out. So now moving on to student-led projects. So this last component of the project is something that we've really been working on over the last year and a half. This can be done in small groups or individually, and we can assist teachers in connecting students to Maui professionals or experts in the field that they are researching for their projects. We created this project pathway map. It does look a little bit overwhelming just at first glance, but it shows you ideas of different projects under mitigation, adaptation and resilience projects, or climate justice and youth activism. So depending on what route a student will take, it gives them ideas of what their project can look like. A couple of examples from this past year from our leadership council. The first one being they research climate resilient plants. So they created these plant profiles after they researched and identified 8 native plants that are climate resilient. And they look at factors like salt resistant, heat, and drought tolerance. And they worked with a staff member at Maui Nui Botanical Gardens. She went through their information and provided feedback, as well as a grad student at UH Manoa who was working on a very similar project. Another team created a short film that covers some of the impacts that sea level rise will have on Maui's coastlines, and the 4 adaptation strategies that can be used to mitigate some of these impacts. The goal was to educate the community on these impacts and those different adaptation strategies, and they worked with Tara Owens. She's the Hawaii Sea Grant coastal hazard expert. So she provided feedback and guidance with this project. You can check out the video on our YouTube channel, give you an idea of a film that was done by our leadership council through this program. And then lastly, Kihei Charter, we worked with them this past spring. They did a slightly different version of student-led projects where they had students work in groups and investigate their solution and report on what they found by creating a website. They would look at how viable their solution was and if it could be implemented here in Hawaii or in our community. Some of the groups looked at food reduction and composting, which was a really great project that was currently being done by the Eco Club on campus. So they hope to continue this as a student-led project next year and reducing the waste that ends up in the landfill. So how we can help? Well, first off, I think it's really important for everybody to check out our Google Classroom and register. That way you can go through all of the different activities. You'll have access to everything that I briefly went over today. And we will be leaving this classroom open this year and posting updates throughout the semester as we continue to modify some of the distance learning activities into in-person. From there, if you're interested or you see things that you can utilize in your classroom, whether it's activities or just resources that we have posted there, please contact us and we can provide you copies of the Google Forms or assist you with copying the different units that you would like to use. In addition to that, we've been working with teachers and we can work with teachers individually and depending on how much time they have to customize a curriculum plan. We do suggest having at least 3 weeks, but if you do the full program in its entirety, it can easily be done or extended into a 2-month program, including student-led projects. We can join your classroom as a guest speaker, and we've done that. We did that quite a bit virtually this past spring. We know that for some teachers, this may be the first time that they're teaching climate literacy curriculum. So if we plan in advance and you contact us, we can join your classroom or support you in teaching this curriculum. Keep in mind, we also have all of those prezzies available on our YouTube channel and in the Google Classroom that you can watch before teaching a lesson. A couple more things here. Although most activities don't require supply kits, some do. I think I covered, the coral bleaching transects. We have those printed out. The ocean acidification lab. We can provide the supply kits to teachers on a first come, first served basis. I did mention we have a field trip component where we visit the Maui Ocean Center and do activities around coral bleaching. When this starts up again, this is something that we can definitely assist with if it's something you're interested in offering your students. Lastly, if you have any questions, especially after you've had the opportunity to explore some of those activities, you can contact us and we would love to help you create a customized curriculum plan depending on how much time you have or the curriculum requirements on your end. I will note that we tend to have more requests and be a little bit busier during the spring, so please get in touch with us early, or if you can fit it in during the fall semester, we can definitely assist. I know I shared a lot today, but I hope it was helpful in seeing some of these resources that you can utilize and how you may be able to implement them in your classroom. Mahalo for joining us. And here are our contact information. Again, my name is Lily Solano, and our executive director is Malia Cahill. Mahalo.